September 1980, a quiet night in Brooklyn. A man named Frank Amato drove to a bar, thinking he was about to change his life. Someone important had called him. A senior figure in the mob wanted to sit down and talk business. After 7 years of being nobody, working a clothing store in Queens, scraping by on petty crimes, this felt like a door opening back up. He walked through the entrance of that bar excited. He never walked back out. What happened inside that building over the next hour was so calculated, so thorough, that to this day, over 40 years later, not a single piece of Frank Amato has ever been found. No remains, no evidence, nothing. But here's what makes this story unlike almost any other mob story you've heard. Frank Amato wasn't killed over money. He wasn't killed because he talked to the feds. He wasn't killed over a drug deal or a territory dispute. He was killed because of what he did to his own wife, inside his own home. And her father, the most powerful mob boss in America, waited 7 full years to do something about it. This is the story of a man who was handed everything, destroyed it all, and spent 7 years thinking he'd gotten away with it. He hadn't. To understand how any of this happened, you first need to understand where Frank Amato came from, because his background explains almost every bad decision he ever made. Amato grew up in Brooklyn in the early 1940s, born out of wedlock, raised in a working-class household by Sicilian immigrant parents who had very little. He was a neighborhood kid with no real path forward. Like a lot of young men in Brooklyn's Italian-American neighborhoods during that era, he eventually drifted toward the edges of the criminal world. But here's the important thing. He never made it past the edges. In the mob, there's a clear hierarchy. At the top, you have the boss. Below him, captains and soldiers, men who are formally inducted, what they call made men. And then at the very bottom, you have associates, men who work for the mob but are never fully of it. They're used when useful and forgotten when not. That was Frank Amato, an associate, a truck hijacker. He and a partner would intercept cargo shipments near JFK Airport, steal the goods and sell them. Small-time work, the kind of criminal career that earns you an arrest record but never any real respect. He had muscle. He had nerve. What he didn't have was a future. And then, through the web of connections that Brooklyn's mob world created, whether people wanted it to or not, Frank Amato met a woman named Constance Castellano. Everyone called her Connie, and that name, Castellano, should tell you everything about how dramatically Frank Amato's life was about to change. Before we go any further, you need to understand who Connie's father was, because without that understanding, nothing that follows makes any sense. Paul Castellano was born in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn in 1915. His father was a butcher and also one of the earliest members of what would eventually become the Gambino crime family, the most powerful organized crime organization in American history. Paul grew up watching his father move between the legitimate world and the criminal one, and he absorbed that model completely. By the time he reached the top, he didn't think like a street gangster. He thought like a CEO. He wasn't interested in flashy violence or running street corners. He was interested in control. Control of industries, control of supply chains, control of unions. By the late 1970s, Castellano controlled New York's construction industry, the waterfront, the garment district, and the entire East Coast wholesale meat market. The FBI was still trying to fully map how embedded he was in the legitimate economy of New York City. He lived in a 10,000-square-foot mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island. His men quietly called it the White House, and not as a joke. Reverently. This was the man whose daughter Frank Amato married. Now think about what that meant for someone like Amato. A small-time truck hijacker with no real standing in the criminal world suddenly had a direct family connection to the most powerful mob boss in America. It was like winning a lottery he hadn't even known he'd entered. He was about to throw every ticket away. Paul Castellano took the marriage seriously from the beginning. In the Sicilian tradition he'd grown up inside, family wasn't just just a word. It was a sacred obligation. When his daughter married a man, that man became his responsibility. So Castellano did what powerful men of his background did. He invested. First, he set Amato up in the Italian ice distribution business, low overhead, real demand in Brooklyn summers, a manageable operation that just needed someone to show up and run it. Amato ran it into the ground. So Castellano tried again. He brought Amato into his meat operation, specifically a company called Dial Meat Purveyors and a retail chain called Meat Palace. This was a much bigger platform. Real money, real opportunity. Now, it's worth knowing what this meat business actually was because it tells you a lot about the world Amato had been handed access to. FBI agent Joseph O'Brien spent years investigating Castellano and documented the operation in his book. Expired meat was treated with a bleaching powder the workers called dynamite to make rancid product look fresh. Formaldehyde was used to drain the smell from deteriorating cuts. Forged government inspection stamps were applied to falsify grades and expiration dates, and the meat wasn't always what the label claimed it was. This product was going to New York's supermarket shelves, to regular families doing their weekly shopping, and Castellano controlled the very union that was supposed to protect the workers inside those stores. That was the empire Amato had been given a seat at. He actually developed some skill there. He learned how to break down a carcass. He was decent with a knife. For the first time in his life, he had a genuine transferable skill. But he couldn't stay out of trouble. He began pursuing female employees at Meat Palace, openly, carelessly, in ways that a Gambino family captain named Anthony Gaggi witnessed directly. In that world, your behavior reflects on whoever vouched for you, and Castellano had vouched for Amato by marriage. Every embarrassment Amato created was a stain on Castellano's household. Gaggi reported what he'd seen to Castellano. The woman was fired. Amato was transferred to the Dial Meat location. He was caught with another woman there too. At that point, Castellano was finished with him professionally. He removed Amato from the business, expelled him from the family home on Tot Hill, and essentially cut him loose. Amato found work at a clothing store in Queens, helped along by Castellano's nephews, Thomas and Joseph Gambino, who apparently felt some leftover obligation to the man their cousin had married. But here's the thing. The affairs, as damaging as they were, weren't what made this situation irreversible. What made it irreversible was something else entirely. A Gambino family associate named Dominic Montiglio eventually became a government witness and gave investigators the most detailed inside account available of what happened in these circles during that era. What he confirmed, along with FBI sources, was this. Frank Amato was physically abusing Connie, beating her repeatedly, and Connie was pregnant at the time. According to sources cited in Murder Machine, a book by journalists Gene Mustaine and Jerry Capezzi that became the definitive account of what followed, Amato beat Connie during that pregnancy severely enough that she lost the child. Now stop and think about what that information meant to Paul Castellano when it reached him. This wasn't a business problem. This wasn't a financial dispute. This wasn't even just an insult to his reputation. Castellano had given this man every resource at his disposal. A business, employment, his home, his daughter, the protection of the most powerful criminal organization in America. And in return, Amato had beaten that daughter, pregnant with his own child, hard enough that she miscarried. In 1973, Connie was granted a divorce from Frank Amato on the grounds of spousal abuse and infidelity. She moved to her father's condominium in West Palm Beach, Florida to recover. The divorce became final, and Frank Amato was still alive. Days passed, months passed, a year went by, then 2, then 3, then 7 full years passed, and Amato, working his clothing store job in Queens, doing small burglaries on the side, apparently began to believe that the worst was behind him. He had completely misread the man across from him. This is the part of the story that people often struggle to understand. If Castellano was so powerful, why did he wait 7 years? The answer tells you everything about who Paul Castellano was. He wasn't a reactive sensitive man, he wasn't going to act on emotion, make a rash decision, and create legal exposure for himself and his family. He was the boss of the most powerful crime organization in America precisely because he didn't operate that way. What he wanted was distance. He wanted the divorce old and legally settled. He wanted Amato living a normal, unsuspecting life. Relaxed, off guard, not looking over his shoulder anymore. He wanted any possible connection between himself and what was coming to be as cold and remote as possible. And when the time finally felt right, he already knew exactly who he was going to use. His name was Roy DeMeo. Roy Albert DeMeo was born in 1940, right there in Flatlands, Brooklyn, the same neighborhood where everything was about to happen. As a young man, he trained as a butcher's apprentice. He graduated from James Madison High School in 1959 and started loan sharking while still a teenager. He spent years building his reputation before being formally inducted into the Gambino family in 1977. By 1980, DeMeo ran his own crew, his own loan sharking operation, his own auto theft ring, his own rackets, and he operated out of a bar on Flatlands Avenue in Brooklyn called the Gemini Lounge. From the outside, the Gemini Lounge looked like any other neighborhood bar. Neon beer signs, a jukebox, regulars at the counter. It was not a neighborhood bar. The back of that building connected to a private apartment, and inside that apartment, DeMeo and his crew had developed what law enforcement would later call the Gemini method, a killing and body disposal process that had been refined over dozens of victims with one specific goal: leave nothing behind. Here's how it worked, step by step, so you understand exactly what Frank Amato walked into. When a target was brought inside, one crew member would approach with a silenced pistol in one hand and a folded towel in the other. One shot to the head. The towel went around the wound immediately, wrapped tight like a bandage, to stop the blood from spreading to the floor. A second crew member would then stab the victim in the heart to stop the blood from continuing to pump. The body was then stripped and carried to the back bathroom to drain completely. Once drained, it was moved onto plastic sheeting in the main room and systematically taken apart. Arms removed, legs removed, head removed. Each piece was individually bagged. The bags went into cardboard boxes, and the boxes, in most cases, went to the Fountain Avenue landfill in Brooklyn, buried under thousands of tons of fresh garbage every single day, making recovery essentially impossible. Law enforcement later estimated DeMeo's crew was responsible for at least 75 murders. Some investigators believed the real number was closer to 200. Roy DeMeo had turned murder into an industrial process, and Paul Castellano, the man who thought like a CEO, understood exactly what that process was worth. The way Frank Amato was brought to the Gemini Lounge that night is almost as chilling as what happened inside. He received a call telling him that Roy DeMeo, a senior Gambino family soldier, wanted to meet with him about a potential business deal. Put yourself in Amato's shoes for a moment. It's 1980. You're 7 years removed from the Castellano world. You're working in a clothing store in Queens. You're nobody. And then, out of nowhere, someone from that world, a real made man, someone with power and money and connections, is calling you to come in and talk business. That call didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a second chance. It felt like the world that had thrown him out was finally opening the door back up. He drove to Flatlands Avenue that night, thinking about opportunity. DeMeo shot him dead with a machine gun. Then DeMeo directed his crew, Borelli, Center, Tester, and the Dimone brothers, through the same process they had carried out dozens of times before. The Gemini method: stripped, drained, dismembered, boxed. But this time there was a different disposal plan. One of the crew members, Richard Dimone, owned a cabin cruiser. They loaded what remained of Frank Amato onto that boat, traveled several miles out into the Atlantic Ocean, and sent the boxes over the side. Frank Amato became the ocean floor. In 1985, after years with no trace of him anywhere, a court formally declared him legally dead. Castellano, DeMeo, and multiple crew members were eventually charged in connection with the disappearance and suspected murder. Not one of them was ever convicted of killing Frank Amato. When there's nothing left to find, there's nothing left to prove. Connie Castellano eventually rebuilt her life. She remarried a man named Joseph Catalaniti, a business associate close to the family. They settled near Tot Hill. They had a daughter together named Andrea. Joseph Catalaniti passed away in November of 1999 at 55 years old. Connie had grown up inside a world that offered protection and exacted costs, and those two things were never separate from each other. Her father, Paul Castellano, was shot and killed outside Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan on December 16, 1985, ordered dead by John Gotti, who seized control of the Gambino family. The White House on Tot Hill went quiet. The empire changed hands. But 5 years before any of that, in September of 1980, Paul Castellano had made one thing permanently clear. He was a man who remembered everything. A man who never rushed, never advertised, never showed his hand. He simply waited until the moment was exactly right. And then he made sure Frank Amato disappeared so completely that there was nothing left to find, nothing left to bury, and nothing left to prove. Some debts don't expire, they just wait. If this story kept you locked in, drop a comment. Tell me which part hit hardest, because there are more stories exactly like this one, and I'm going to keep digging them up. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Hit the notification bell so these actually reach you, and I'll see you in the next one.